Now, I have to say, the force of this, I understand why this is passionately preached as a proof text by my Calvinist brothers, because it does sound flatly like, hey, look, man, there's not even one person who's going to seek after God and understand this.
I used to think that Dr. Flowers was a mastermind of deception. But after his response to my last video, it's become clear to me that I was wrong about it. For this, I apologize. Flowers is no genius DC comic book supervillain. Rather, he is ignorant beyond all semblance of biblical literacy and so enslaved to the doctrines created by his own deceitful heart that he has no choice but to turn to these analogies to explain his religion. And yes, I say his religion because the argument you're about to hear is in no way supported by biblical Christianity. Revisionism is a religion from the flesh, and as such, it is one of the many enemies that must be placed under the feet of Christ.
Romans 3:9-12 says, "What then? Are we better than they? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside together. They have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one."
The first thing that you have to understand about this passage is that it does not exist in a vacuum. This is part of Paul's letter to the church in Rome, wherein he is interpreting history to explain the gospel in full. He begins his gospel in chapter 1 by laying out a charge on all of mankind who actively suppress the truth in unrighteousness. He describes this as an internal issue of the heart, explaining in chapter 2 that it is the circumcision of the heart performed by God that frees us from this corrupted state. Paul is not being poetic here. He is repeating the doctrine laid out by Ezekiel in chapter 36, which speaks of God removing our heart of stone, replacing it with a heart of flesh. By chapter 3, Paul is laying on thick what it means to be under sin. He says that none are righteous, none understand, no one seeks for God, no one does good, and there is no fear of God before their eyes. When God reveals that this is you, that it is you that does not know the way of peace, it should lead you to despair of your life. You are enslaved to sin, and your hope is not in yourself to make righteous decisions. Rather, your hope is in Christ, setting you free.
Now, I have to say, the force of this, I understand why this is passionately preached as a proof text by my Calvinist brothers, because it does sound flatly like, hey, look, man, there's not even one person who's going to seek after God and understand this. So what's your response, Dr. Flowers?
Yeah, it's actually a quote from Psalm 14 where he's comparing the righteous, the generation of the righteous with those who say in their heart there is no God.
Notice the difference in how we determine the context of this passage. I allow Paul to build his argument against humanity naturally in letter format, while Flowers runs back to Psalm 14 to try and find the context for this passage. He thinks that he has found something that supports his theology, but instead, he only proves that his heart has deceived him. Allow me to explain. When he sees that a comparison is made between the generation of the righteous and those who say in their heart there is no God, he imagines himself to be the former. He thinks, I'm safe because I say there is a God. Therefore, I am not among the fools. Well, it doesn't say that the fool will say that there is no God with his mouth. It says he will say it with his heart. The heart is deceitful. By the time that thought gets to the mouth, it can look completely different. With his heart, he says there is no God, but with his mouth, he says, my God would never plan for mankind to be in this state. The problem is, if you are a Christian today, you were something else before you were born again. And at that time, you were the fool who said in his heart that there is no God. This may have expressed itself as anything from atheism to provisionism. But in the end, it is God changing your heart that causes you to love him.
And so these actual words that he's quoting from are actually about people who do not have faith. And the other issue there is, again, we would affirm with our Calvinistic brothers that no one is righteous in accordance to the law. No one can attain righteousness by works or good deeds. All have fallen short. No one seeks God in such a way as to merit their salvation or in a sufficient way to earn their way to heaven. We all agree with that. But the verse says nothing about our inability to respond to a God who comes to us.
This is one of Flowers' infamous bait and switch tactics. He says, we agree that no man seeks God in such a way as to merit his salvation. But who is he agreeing with? Though that is certainly a true statement, that is not what this passage says. It says, no man seeks God. And it does not include the context of meriting salvation, but rather it is in the context of describing what it looks like for man to be under sin. He does not agree with us on this passage, because the passage never says that. So the bait is the idea that this passage says, no man seeks God in such a way as to merit his salvation. If you agree that that is true as a statement, you must also agree that the passage is teaching this. And if you agree with this, you must also agree that it doesn't teach that we cannot respond to God when he seeks us. The problem is, the passage doesn't add either of those concepts. It just says that no man seeks God. Period.
And so I could say to you, it's impossible for me to get the president on the phone right now. It's impossible. I can try and try and try. It's impossible. I can't get through. Does that therefore conclude I can't answer the phone if the president were to call me? Of course not.
It should be clear why this analogy is so dangerous. He's comparing the call of God to a phone call from the President of the United States. Let's take a closer look at this analogy to see if it connects. When you call Donald Trump, why can you not get through? Is it because you are an enemy of Donald Trump and your sin separates you from his holiness to such a degree that an extra-dimensional veil is placed between you and the president? When God calls, is it like a telephone meeting that anyone can just pick up and respond to? Or does God's call go out in the Spirit? Flowers is only able to use this analogy comparing God to the president because there is no fear of God before his eyes.